The city of Chester was in the kingdom of Mercia, on the west side, which is where the English lived. Even so, there were some Vikings living in Chester in the year 902. These were Vikings who had come over from Ireland. They'd fallen out with their king, and they'd arrived at Chester asking the queen there, Lady Ethelfled, if she could give them a home. And she had very kindly said yes. And so there in Chester, the Irish Vikings lived alongside the English, and it seemed like it was a very happy kingdom to live in. But over on the east side of Mercia, that was where the Danish Vikings had made their home. And they were looking for any opportunity to take over the west side and follow up on their father Guthrum's plan to subdue all of the English. As soon as the Danish learned that some Irish were living in Chester, they thought this was their chance. So some Danish soldiers went and hid in the forests that surrounded the walls of the city of Chester. And they sent spies into the city to call out the Irish, so that together they could make a plan to take down Lady Ethelfled and rule the city of Chester and dominate the English. The thing was that the Irish kind of liked Lady Ethelfled. She'd given them a home after all. She'd been very kind to them. And so, while the Danish were asleep, some of the Irish slipped back into the city of Chester to warn Lady Ethelfled and her soldiers what the Danish were planning. The next day, the Danish soldiers arrived at the city walls to find, rather to their surprise, that the guards weren't anywhere to be seen. Conquering the city of Chester was going to be a hop, a skip, and a jump. The Vikings merrily walked through the city gates straight into an ambush. All of Lady Ethelfled's soldiers were there waiting for them to charge at them and chase them all the way back into the forest. But Vikings don't give up that easily. They may have been beaten once, but now they had learned their lesson. This time, they got some ladders, and they determined to put those ladders against the side of Chester's city walls, climb up to the top, and drop down on the English soldiers inside, pointing their swords at them. The very next day, the guards were up along the top of Chester's city walls when they saw the Viking Danish coming out from the forest carrying those ladders, and they knew exactly what they wanted to do. They ran to Lady Ethelfled and said, Our lady, what are we going to do?" And Lady Ethelfled thought for a moment and then said, "Gather up everyone in the kingdom and tell them to bring old bits of furniture that they don't really want anymore. Tables, chairs, and anything, wardrobes. Just bring them to the city walls." A short while later, the Danish had their ladders leaned against the side of Chester's city walls and were climbing up, ready with their swords, when an English guard poked his head out over the top and said, "Here, have a seat!" Suddenly, chairs were raining down on the Danish. They couldn't hold on to the ladders with really heavy bits of furniture landing on their heads. So they let go and went crashing to the ground with a huge bump. And then they turned and they ran all the way back into the forest. But Vikings don't give up that easily. And although they had been sent back twice, well, they had learned their lesson. This time, they were still going to lean the ladders up and go up with swords ready to drop down on the English inside. But the first Vikings to climb the ladders were going to carry shields, so they would be protected from any heavy objects raining down on top of them. And the following day, as the Viking Danish came out from the forest approaching the city walls of Chester, carrying their ladders and their swords and their shields. The guards of Chester saw them coming and knew exactly what they were planning. So they rushed to Lady Ethelfled and said, "Oh, lady, what are we going to do?" Lady Ethelfled thought for a moment and then said, "Go and find the makers of the mead and tell them to get their drink nice and warm." Now, if you haven't heard of mead, that was one of the favourite drinks of English and Danish and Irish, and in fact pretty much everybody who lived on the island of Britain at the time. It was a nice warm hot drink that you made with honey. And so, many of the people who made mead were also beekeepers, and at Ethelfled's command, they brought many barrels of mead to the city walls, and with them also brought cauldrons so they could start warming it up until it was bubbling and boiling. Meanwhile, the Danish were leaning their ladders against the side of the city walls and were beginning to climb up, with the Vikings holding shields heading up first. But as they got close, a little English head popped out over the city walls and said, "Here! Thirsty?" And before the Danish knew it, the English were pouring buckets of boiling hot mead down onto their shields. Now, the boiling hot mead didn't bounce off like a chair might have done. Instead, it stuck to those metal shields, and they began to get scalding hot, too hot for the Danish holding them to keep their grip. They had to let go, and as they let go of the shield, it collapsed on their head, meaning that they let go of the ladder, and they fell down onto the Danish below them, who fell down onto the Danish below them, who fell down onto the Danish below them, and soon they had all landed on the ground with a very heavy bump. After this, they got up and they ran back into the forest. But Vikings don't give up that easily. And even though they had been defeated thrice, they had learned their lessons. They knew what they had to do this time. They took their metal shields and they wrapped them in leather. So even if you poured boiling hot mead on them, they weren't going to get scalding hot. They weren't going to drop them, not this time. And the very next day, the Danish left the forest, carrying their ladders and their swords and their shields wrapped in leather. When they were spotted by the English guards who were stationed along the walls of Chester, those guards ran down to Lady Ethelfled and explained to her what they could see, and then said, "Lady, what are we going to do?" Well, Lady Ethelfled thought for a moment, and then she said, "Go and find the makers of the mead and bring them to the city walls." But the English guards replied, "Lady, we've tried that, but like we said, they've wrapped their metal shields in leather." But Lady Ethelfled just said, "Don't worry, we're not going to be giving them mead this time." Meanwhile, the Danish had brought their ladders up to the walls of the city of Chester and had leaned them against it and were climbing up again, ready to drop down on the English on the inside, aiming their swords at them pointy end first. And the Danish climbing up first had their shields held aloft, wrapped in leather to protect them from boiling hot mead, when suddenly the head of an English guard poked up over the top of the city walls and said, "This might sting a little." And before the Danish knew it, the English soldiers were dropping beehives down on their heads. Now, when the beehives crashed down on those shields, all of the bees came out and they were very angry. And an angry bee will usually sting the closest object near it, which in this case were the Danish Vikings. The Danish found it very difficult to hold on to a ladder with stings going on all over their bodies, and before they knew it, They were falling down on the Danish below them, who were falling down on the Danish below them, who were falling down on the Danish below them, and they all hit the ground with a heavy bump. And they turned around and they ran off through the forest. They kept on going, and they didn't stop, because a Viking doesn't give up that easily. But neither did Lady Ethelfled. And that night, the whole city of Chester, the English and the Irish Vikings, celebrated the wisdom of Lady Ethelfled.